There is a moment in the very first episode of The Chosen that most viewers have never looked up. A woman is crouched on the dirt floor of a tavern, drawing in the dust with her finger. It looks like nervous habit, background texture, the kind of detail you register without registering. But Dallas Jenkins, the creator of the series, built that scene around a single documented event from the Gospel of John that almost every church has read and almost no one has connected to this opening image. What that woman is drawing and why she is drawing it is not explained in the episode. It doesn't need to be, because if you have read John chapter 8, you already know. And if you haven't, you are about to understand why that 11-second image may be the most theologically precise scene in the entire series. That is what The Chosen is doing beneath the surface. And that is exactly what we are going to find today. The Chosen launched in 2017 as a crowd-funded pilot and became, by 2021, the most watched Christian media production in history, distributed across its own free app to over 100 million viewers without a single major studio behind it. Dallas Jenkins, its creator, is not a theologian. He is a filmmaker who grew up in an evangelical household, made a Christmas movie that flopped in theaters, and then, by his own account, had a crisis of faith followed by a conversation with a Catholic priest and a Jewish rabbi that changed how he understood the story he wanted to tell. That ecumenical foundation matters enormously. Jenkins consulted priests, pastors, and rabbis throughout production. He has said in multiple interviews that his singular goal was to make Jesus knowable, not as an institution, not as a theological concept, but as a person who walked into real situations involving real broken human beings and changed them. What he built to serve that goal, however, goes much deeper than accessible storytelling, because scattered throughout the narrative, in the casting choices, the invented backstories, the settings, the specific miracles chosen for each season, are connections to Scripture so precise that they function as a second layer of meaning running underneath everything the show says out loud. On the surface, The Chosen is a character drama. That is its stated purpose and its most obvious achievement. It gives names to nameless people. It gives personalities to figures who appear in the Gospels for a single verse and then vanish. Matthew is depicted with traits associated with autism: methodical, emotionally distant, fixated on data and order. Peter is a fisherman drowning in gambling debts to Roman-connected creditors, desperate for a miracle not from faith but from necessity. Mary Magdalene, before her encounter with Jesus, is shown as a woman possessed, literally, and working in a Roman tavern to survive, her identity so fractured that she has adopted a false name. The show calls her Lilith in those opening scenes. That detail, the name Lilith, landed quietly for most viewers, but it is doing something specific. Lilith in Jewish tradition carries the weight of one of the oldest archetypes of the demonic feminine. It is a loaded choice, and Jenkins made it deliberately. The surface message the show communicates is compassionate and clear. These people were broken before Jesus found them. They were not chosen because they were worthy. They were chosen because they were real. The Sermon on the Mount, when The Chosen arrives there, is not a theological lecture. It is rain-soaked and muddy, and the disciples aren't sure what they're hearing. That is the surface message. You don't have to be put together for Jesus to call you. But that's only what the show wants you to see. Here is what it doesn't realize it's also saying, or rather, what it is saying with far more precision than it lets on. Before I go further, I want to hear from you. When you first watched The Chosen, was there a specific character moment that hit you in a way you couldn't explain? Something that felt true before you knew why? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Open the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 2. It reads, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. 7, not 1. The number 7 in biblical literature is never accidental. It is the number of completeness, of covenantal wholeness. When Luke says 7 demons, he is not giving a medical count. He is saying, this woman was wholly possessed. Every dimension of her personhood had been occupied, and when Jesus cast them out, the liberation was total, complete, covenantal. The Chosen shows the possession, shows the deliverance, shows the aftermath, but it does not explain the number. It doesn't have to. Because what Luke is doing is building a shadow of something that appears 40 chapters earlier in the Torah. In Leviticus 14, the cleansing of a person pronounced unclean, someone cut off from community, from the temple, from covenant life, required a ritual involving 7 days, 7 sprinklings of blood, a complete restoration process that mirrored the 7-day structure of creation itself. When Jesus drives out 7 demons from Mary Magdalene, Luke is not writing psychology, he is writing liturgy. He is saying, what Jesus just did is a new creation, a new Genesis. And Mary Magdalene is its first documented human witness. Now look at what The Chosen does with her after her deliverance. It places her in the inner circle before the 12 are even assembled. It shows her as the one who understands Jesus' tone, his humor, his grief, before Peter does. That is not dramatic license. That tracks precisely with what John 20 records. That Mary Magdalene was the first person to whom the risen Jesus appeared, first at the tomb, first at the resurrection. The woman who carried 7 demons became the first witness to the event that defines all of Christianity. The Chosen earns that arc. It just doesn't tell you it's the same arc Scripture drew first. Matthew is even more layered. The show's portrayal of him as neurodivergent, precise, pattern-focused, socially disconnected, is an invention. Jenkins has acknowledged this openly. There is no biblical text that diagnoses Matthew. But here is what Jenkins may not have consciously realized. By making Matthew a man who cannot read social situations but can read data with extraordinary accuracy, he accidentally illuminated something the Gospel of Matthew itself does relentlessly. Matthew's Gospel is the most structured of the 4. It organizes Jesus' teachings into 5 major discourse blocks, intentionally mirroring the 5 books of the Torah. It obsessively documents fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, citing it over 40 times. Matthew the tax collector, in real historical context, would have been a man trained in Roman accounting systems, literate in multiple languages, precise, systematic, and despised by his community for collaboration with the empire. The Chosen's Matthew, rigid, detail-oriented, socially marginalized, is not historically verified, but he is textually consistent with the man who wrote the most architecturally deliberate gospel in the canon. Here is where it gets precise enough to be unsettling. Look at the scene in Season 1 where Jesus meets Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee, a member of the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious council of Jerusalem. In the show, he encounters Mary Magdalene before her deliverance and is the one who first attempts and fails to heal her. He then follows that failure to Jesus. That sequence is not in any gospel. John 3, where Nicodemus appears, gives no backstory for how he found Jesus or what moved him to come at night. But Jenkins' invention does something that is theologically coherent. Nicodemus is a man who has the entire system of religious knowledge at his disposal: the law, the temple, the protocols of healing and purification, and none of it works on this woman. He is a man broken by the limits of his own understanding. And then John 3 records the conversation where Jesus tells him, "You must be born again," or in more accurate translation from the Greek, "You must be born from above." The Greek word is anothen, which carries both meanings simultaneously. Nicodemus hears "again" and is confused. How does a grown man enter his mother's womb? Jesus means from above, from the Spirit. The chosen builds a Nicodemus who has tried everything from below, every human, institutional, religious mechanism, and found it empty. His journey to that night conversation with Jesus is not scriptural, but it is one of the most theologically accurate setups for John 3 ever put on screen. Because the whole point of anothen is that the birth Jesus describes cannot come from human effort. It comes from above. And Nicodemus, in both the biblical text and in Jenkins' dramatization, is a man who has exhausted everything below. Notice what the show does with water in that same season. Water is everywhere. The Sea of Galilee, where Peter works. The ritual baths, the mikvot, where purification happens under Jewish law. The storm that terrifies the disciples. And then, quietly, without announcement, John the Baptist baptizing in the Jordan. Every one of these water images in the chosen maps onto a water theology that runs through the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis 1, the Spirit hovering over the waters of creation, through Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea as the birth of a nation, through Ezekiel 47, the river flowing from the temple that brings life wherever it goes, to Revelation 22, the river of the water of life running through the New Jerusalem. The Chosen is not illustrating a Bible story. It is illustrating a biblical grammar. Water in Scripture is always the site of new beginnings, of thresholds between death and life. Jenkins may have placed those scenes for texture, but they are doing systematic theology. The most striking of these moments is one that almost no viewer has passed. In Season 2, Jesus is shown at a wedding, the wedding at Cana, the first miracle, the turning of water into wine. John 2:1 specifies that this happened on the third day. Most readings treat that as a calendar detail. But John is not writing a diary. Every time John uses the phrase, the third day, or the third hour, or after 3 days, he is pointing. The resurrection happens on the third day. The temple will be raised in 3 days, Jesus says. Jonah was in the fish 3 days. The first miracle, abundance from emptiness, new life from stone jars, happens on the third day. The Chosen stages Cana with joy and laughter and a panicked wedding planner, as it should. But underneath the party, John is telling you, this is a resurrection story. This is what the whole story is building toward. It starts here. What the Chosen has achieved, quietly without stating it, is something that very few religious productions have managed. It has made Scripture spatially legible. The connections between scenes in the show and patterns in the biblical text are not decorative. They are structural. When Jenkins decided to humanize Jesus, to show him with humor, with fatigue, with grief, He was not diluting the theology. He was recovering something the earliest church understood and later centuries of religious art frequently buried. The theological term is kenosis. It comes from Philippians 2:7, where Paul writes that Jesus emptied himself. The Greek word is ekenosin, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness. The incarnation is not Jesus wearing humanity like a costume. It is God fully entering human experience. A Jesus who laughs at his own jokes, who gets hungry, who weeps publicly at Lazarus's tomb. That is not a compromise of divinity. That is the theological claim of kenosis made visible. The chosen did not invent this. It recovered it. And in recovering it, it made legible the connections between the stories of the people who followed Jesus and the ancient patterns of Scripture that those stories were fulfilling, sometimes without those people knowing. Peter did not know he was a type of the stumbling prophet, called and falling and called again, echoing Moses and Jeremiah and Elijah before him. Mary Magdalene did not know her restoration was written in the liturgical language of Leviticus. Nicodemus did not know the conversation in John 3 would become the most quoted passage in Western civilization. But it was all there, underneath the human drama, running like a current beneath everything the camera shows you. That is what Scripture does. It does not illustrate history. It reveals the architecture of a reality that human eyes alone cannot resolve. The chosen gave that architecture a face, a voice, a first-century muddy cloak, and a handful of disciples who had no idea what they had walked into. And neither, it turns out, did most of us watching. If this is the kind of layer you want to keep finding, the kind that changes how you read both the screen and the page, subscribe. Because there is an entire canon of stories that have been doing this for millennia, and we have barely started.